This week we're looking at essay organization and thesis statements, and the two are definitively linked, and we're going to look at how that looks or what that looks like using a sample paper. All right, so from the textbook that you'll read later this semester, whether you are writing a short essay or a doctoral dissertation, your thesis statement will arguably be the most difficult sentence to formulate. An effective thesis statement states the purpose of the paper and therefore functions to control, assert, and structure your entire argument. Without a sound thesis, your argument is weak, lacking in direction, and uninteresting to the reader. And so that's what we're going to unpack in this particular video. Developing a thesis, first you have to understand what the purpose of a thesis is. The thesis is an assertion that academic writers make at the beginning of what they write and then support with evidence. And the evidence is key. You can't just say something and expect the reader to trust you. You have to give illustrations and examples that relate to or support the actual thesis. So your thesis covers everything discussed in the essay. It's not just a useless sentence at the start of the essay or paper. I had a student one semester who said he never wrote a conclusion because he didn't get the point. The point is to wrap up everything that you supposedly proved from your thesis, and we'll get into that more when we talk about introductions and conclusions. So if you think of your thesis like a skewer, like you are making a shish kebab, the thesis statement is a skewer that penetrates every paragraph. It holds the paragraphs together. So think about that, where everything in your thesis should be represented by each of your paragraphs, is ultimately what that's saying. Another way to look at it is that the thesis is a signpost to show readers and remind readers what the argument is and why the writer is including certain evidence. And so it has many purposes, the thesis statement. It makes assertions that are clearly defined, focused, and supported. Those assertions we call claims. It reflects an awareness of a larger conversation, and that's some of the reading that you did over entering the conversation or something along that lines. Really is about what is the larger academic conversation that this topic is invested in. The thesis is placed at the beginning of the essay and paper. In my class for the rest of the semester, it is the last sentence of the introduction. If the introduction is one paragraph, then it's at the bottom of that first paragraph. Later, you may have, definitely in Comp 2, you might have an introduction that's multiple paragraphs, so your thesis would go at the end of that, the last introductory paragraph. For my class as well, from here on out, you need to underline your thesis statement. Do not forget this. It's 5 points for getting to underline your thesis statement. The point of a thesis is that it penetrates every paragraph, like we said with the shish kebab. In other words, it should represent everything that you're trying to prove. It also acknowledges other points of view, showing that you understand that it's a complex issue. It's not like a debate where you try and just persuade or argue aggressively. You actually have to acknowledge the other's point of view because they're not present. Does that make sense? They're not in the room with you, so you have to represent their side or their point of view in your paper. It shows an awareness of reader assumptions. It also helps them to anticipate what their reply might be. It helps you to identify your counter arguments. Ultimately, the goal is for you to show a fresh perspective on an existing topic, and we'll see more of that when we look at the next assignment. So you usually start with a working thesis. Some people keep the same thesis throughout. Some people have to change it going through. Basically, you start with a question. So what stereotypes are present in movie X? Or what are the broader implications for our culture if these stereotypes persist? Or why do these stereotypes persist? Those are important questions that the thesis is designed. We start asking questions, and then the thesis is ultimately the answer to those questions. A working thesis is your first attempt at defining your position on the broader issue. It guides your research as you pursue an avenue of inquiry. So it gives you a sense of direction before you have all the facts. It should be open to change. Never accept your working thesis as your final position. In other words, don't go into research with a closed mind. It's called a working thesis so that as you get more information on the topic, you are open to change, and so therefore your thesis might change along with your own opinions. And I'll show you an example here in a minute. So here's an example of a working thesis. The harmful implications of ongoing exposure to these unattainable ideals, such as low self-esteem, eating disorders, unhealthy body issues, and acceptance of violence, make urgent the need for change. So this is a student working thesis on a discussion of Barbie. Maybe your family, this was not an issue. My mother despised Barbie. We weren't allowed to have a Barbie in our house. And for many of the reasons that are here. And so their claims are that Barbie is an unattainable ideal. The red words are the supporting details, and the slant is the change. So I always tell students, what I'm looking for in a thesis is I want to know what your topic is, what your slant is, and by slant, I mean like what's your take on this particular topic, and then what's your supporting evidence. So if you looked at that thesis statement, it actually sets up the organization for the paper. So it has the introduction that talks about the unattainable ideal of Barbie. And then the thesis is underlined at the end of the introductory paragraph. And then the body covers those main supporting details: the low self-esteem, eating disorders, unhealthy body issues, and acceptance of violence. And then the conclusion should wrap up what was proven in the paper and should discuss the concept of change, or the idea of changing the ideal Barbie body. So then the student research went a little bit sideways. Barbie morphs into a more interesting discussion about the cultural norms of beauty and their influences on self-perception and behavior. So the person writing this was like, Barbie's interesting, but what's really interesting to me is the ideal of beauty and how that's impacted by culture. So then the student revises their working thesis. Although evidence may be provided to argue that gender is an innate characteristic, I will show that it is actually the result of one's actions, which are labeled masculine or feminine according to society's definition of ideal gender. Your thesis statements will be one sentence, but this is probably a composition 2 paper. Further, I will discuss the communication of such definitions through the media, specifically in music videos, on TV and magazines, and the harmful implications of being exposed to these ideals. So now we have to revise it. There's some clunkiness to this thesis statement that we want to get rid of. The first one is to get rid of the I or announcement phrases. Typically, these statements serve no purpose in the paper. We know it's your paper, so we know that you're going to show. We know that you're going to discuss. So we just get rid of the I will show and the I will discuss from there, because we know it's your paper. We know these are your ideas. Now, for Comp 1 and the first part of Comp 2, I want this to be revised down to one sentence. So you can see instead of a separate sentence, there's a semicolon here. And so that's the way to connect the two ideas. So it's one sentence so far. This is what it boils down to. Although evidence suggests that gender is an innate characteristic, the perception of gender is a result of individual actions which society labels masculine or feminine as an idealized representation of gender through the media, specifically in music videos, on TV, and in magazines, and the harmful implications of being exposed to these ideals. So that's a much more refined thesis statement. What's the point? So be willing to change your research or your working thesis as research develops. So don't get stuck on one idea and think you have to stay there. It's just, the phrase is working thesis, meaning it can and should be changed. And the textbook says, as paradoxical as it may sound, you are unlikely to know exactly what point you will make until after you've written the paper in which you made it. So that's oftentimes why I suggest writing the introduction and conclusion last, because by then you know what you've said. And so you've worked out some of the kinks of what your plan was. There's different types of thesis statements. We're going to discuss the correcting misinterpretations model, the filling the gap model, the modifying what others have said model, and the hypothesis testing model. So these are different types of thesis. Sometimes you'll see them in different disciplines. So you might not see the hypothesis testing model in English, but you would see it in a science class. The correcting misinterpretations model is to correct writers whose arguments you believe has misconstrued one or more aspects of an issue. And there's key phrases that we use to make those kinds of statements. So although many scholars have argued about A and B, a careful examination suggests C. So notice one, the signal phrases, the words that you use signal to readers that you're correcting others' ideas without being dismissive. So you're saying some scholars are talking about this, but we're going to examine this. And so you're doing it in a way that's not directly disrespectful to the original writers. The filling the gap model. And I want to actually go back to that idea of being not being dismissive. I think it's really tempting, particularly in today's culture, to be dismissive of somebody else's ideas. The problem with that is that's not a conversation. That's not how you solve problems. And so your job is to present both viewpoints in a way that the person on the other side would see and recognize their ideas in your paper. So another type of thesis is the filling in the gap model. So it points to what other writers have overlooked or ignored about a certain issue. Although scholars have noted A and B, they have missed the importance of C. Several years ago, I had a student who was a very strong proponent of the Second Amendment. He owned his own gun shop, and he came in and he basically said, there is never a time when I would want to see a limitation put on gun ownership. So he wanted to do a paper on gun control, but he really didn't want to explore it in a way that was academic, in a way that was open to new ideas. So what he ended up doing, it was kind of interesting. He did a little research and he found out the statistics on senior citizens harming or killing a family member or somebody who's in the house, a caregiver, because they think it's an intruder, is actually pretty high and it's very dangerous. And so he ended up writing his paper on the one time he sees maybe that we need to fill in this gap. Nobody's talking about what happens with senior citizens who own guns. And so he's filling in that gap of, what about seniors? What do we do if we take away their car keys? At what point do we take away their weapons? Modifying what others have said model is basically saying you kind of start from there and you go in a direction of your own. So although I agree with A and B ideas of other writers, it is important to extend, refine, or limit their ideas with C. So in other words, you're saying, these people said this, but here's what we need to look at. So you could even look at that with the What is Poverty essay. Although I agree that poverty is bad and she experienced all these things, it's important to refine her ideas and make them more modern because that was written so much long ago. The student writer needs to ensure that he or she understands the complexity of a problem by building on and extending the ideas of others. So in other words, make sure you know the facts before you start building on them. So in other words, you're going to have to do some reading to inform yourself. And that's why it says first read to understand. Figure out what the other side is saying, or even what your side is saying, and then build on that. So make sure you have that initial understanding that you can relay to your audience. No, I did that one. Okay. And then the hypothesis testing model. We do not often see this in English class, but the evidence is based on a hypothesis that researchers will continue to test by examining individual cases through an inductive method until the evidence proves or refutes the hypothesis. And so you can see right there, that's one of those things that you're more likely to see in a science class. And some language that would be used would be something like, some people explain A by suggesting B, but a close analysis of the problem reveals the possibility of several competing explanations. So what you're saying, you're developing a thesis. I had a student actually do this in English class. He started with a hypothesis that there was no difference between organic food and non-organic food and that you couldn't taste the difference. And so he looked up research for that, but then he went with this hypothesis and he cooked the same recipes with organic foods and not organic foods and actually tested it on his family. That was a very interesting direction for an English paper, but most of the time a hypothesis testing model was going to be more related to behavioral sciences or sciences. All right, so in addition to defining the purpose and focus of an essay, the thesis must set up the context for the writer's claim, which is also part of what your introduction is doing. The topic of the conversation is what you're needing to establish, and you have to show if it's current and relevant. So one of the complaints about Parker's essay is it's still relevant, but it is definitely not recent. Briefly summarize what others have said, and the key there is to summarize it in a way that they would recognize their idea in your statement. So don't try and use biased language or misconstrue things, because that's going to get you in trouble. This is not a persuasive speech where it's just kill the opposition. It's about having a good conversation on the page before you reach a conclusion. So after you've summarized what others have said, then explain the problem as the writer sees it. So what do you see the problem is? And then you state your thesis. So you can see this is a funnel that leads down towards your thesis. And that's the goal of your introduction, is to provide information and keep narrowing it down until you can state what your thesis is. So let's apply it to the concept of Barbie. You have the introduction about unattainable ideals. You have a thesis that's underlined at the very end of the introductory paragraph. And then we have 4 paragraphs. So those main claims that show up in the thesis, they now become your topic sentences. If the focus of your first paragraph is low self-esteem, then the concept of low self-esteem needs to show up in that topic sentence. And the focus of every piece of evidence or illustration in that paragraph needs to maintain that focus on low self-esteem. So you can see that in this example, there are 4 body paragraphs before the student gets to the conclusion, which is we need to make changes about how we see beauty and how beauty can lead to unhealthy behaviors. All right, so we're not going to do that particular activity this semester. That's the first part of thesis statements. We're going to look closely at some specific concepts in the next video.